The morning fog clung to the ground like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The old wooden fence behind Harold Whitaker's farmhouse groaned softly in the breeze, weathered by years of storms and silence. At 62, Harold lived alone, tucked away in the outskirts of the small town of Elmridge. His only companions were 3 loyal German shepherds: Focko, the stoic leader; Sarge, the playful heart; and Odin, the ever-watchful guardian. But that quiet morning, as Harold stepped out to inspect the lower fields, something near the fence line caught his eye, something that did not belong. Curled in a patch of dew-soaked grass, trembling and barely conscious, lay a small creature with orange fur and dark stripes. At first, Harold thought it was a large cat or perhaps a strange dog, until it lifted its head and let out a weak, desperate cry. It was a tiger cub, thin, wounded, and clearly abandoned. No tracks, no mother in sight, only this fragile, breathing mystery, as if the wild itself had delivered it to his doorstep. Harold, heart pounding, removed his jacket and gently scooped the animal into his arms. Back in the house, Focko, Sarge, and Odin met him at the door, their ears alert, tails still. The scent of the tiger set them on edge. Odin let out a low growl, but Harold whispered calmly, "Easy now, he's just a baby." As Harold laid the cub on a blanket by the fireplace, something strange happened. Instead of hostility, Focko approached slowly, sniffed the cub, and then lay down beside it. Moments later, Sarge joined, curling against its tiny frame. Odin hesitated, but eventually lay down, forming a protective triangle around the stranger. Harold watched in awe. That kind of trust, that kind of bond couldn't be forced. It was chosen. He named the cub Kai, a name that once belonged to his estranged son, Talon Whitaker's childhood nickname. The choice felt right, like a second chance, somehow. Over the next few days, Kai began to recover. He was bottle-fed, bathed, and never left alone. The dogs accepted him fully, as one of their own. He napped on Sarge's back and chased Odin's tail in clumsy circles. But even as laughter returned to Harold's home, a quiet tension lingered. Kai was growing fast. His paws, his eyes, even the way he watched the world, it was changing. Something wild stirred beneath the surface. Something the dogs didn't yet see. But Focko did. The old shepherd stared at Kai for long moments, as if sensing the edge of something powerful and dangerous. And deep down, Harold knew it too. This peace, they all felt it. But it would not last. Weeks passed, and Kai was no longer the fragile cub Harold had cradled by the fireplace. His legs had grown stronger, his body leaner, his gaze sharper. What was once playful curiosity had turned into calculated observation. He no longer followed the dogs, he studied them. Focko noticed it first. The old shepherd had stopped sleeping as deeply, often waking with a growl low in his throat when Kai passed by. Though Kai still nestled against them at night, something had shifted. There was an edge in his movements now, a precision that came not from love, but from instinct. Harold tried to ignore it. He convinced himself that Kai was simply maturing. Every animal had its phase, but there were signs he couldn't dismiss. One morning, Odin came limping into the kitchen, a scratch on his side deeper than any play fight should have left. Sarge grew quieter, sticking closer to Harold's side, his usual cheerful demeanor dimming. Focko, ever the sentinel, now kept himself between Kai and the others whenever possible. The unity that had once defined them was cracking, and Harold was helpless to stop it. It was during a visit to town that the first real concern took shape. As Harold stood in line at the feed store, someone recognized him. Cale Rourke, a local journalist, leaned over and said with a smirk, "That true, Whitaker? You got yourself a tiger living with dogs out there." Harold didn't answer, but the damage was done. Within days, Blaine Carrick, his uptight neighbor to the south, was at his door demanding answers. "It's not natural," Blaine spat, "and it sure as hell ain't safe. What happens when that thing turns?" Harold slammed the door in his face, but the words stuck. That night, as he sat in the old armchair watching Kai chew on a rope toy that once belonged to Odin, he couldn't shake Blaine's voice. He remembered the past, Talon, his estranged son, storming out after a fight over boundaries and control. Harold had always believed that love could fix anything. But maybe love wasn't enough to change nature. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. He called in Vaughn Mercer, an old friend and experienced vet. Vaughn examined Kai carefully, noting his muscle development, his reflexes, and, most worryingly, his eye contact. "He doesn't look at you like a pet," Vaughn said softly. "He looks at you like an equal. That's rare and dangerous." That night, Harold stood outside, watching Kai roam the yard under the moonlight. Silent, graceful, untouchable. Not a cub anymore. Not quite a beast either. But something in between. Something the world wouldn't understand. Something even Harold was beginning to fear. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of day where the wind was still and the birds didn't sing. Harold had left the gate to the east pasture open by mistake. The same gate that bordered Blaine Carrick's property. He realized it too late. Only when he heard Focko barking loud and sharp. Not the usual warning but something primal. By the time Harold got there, Kai had crossed the line. In the middle of Blaine's yard stood the young tiger, tall now, his shoulders broad. His gaze locked on a flock of chickens scattering in panic. One of them was already limp in his jaw. Blaine came out shouting, shotgun in hand. "Back off, Carrick," Harold yelled, raising both arms. But Blaine didn't lower the gun. "That thing is a predator, Harold. It's not your damn dog." The standoff lasted less than a minute, but it left an invisible scar. Kai, sensing tension, dropped the chicken and calmly walked back to Harold's side, unbothered by the weapon, as if he already knew no one could stop him. That night, the sheriff came knocking. Slade Rennick was a fair man, but the law didn't bend for emotional bonds. "Look, I get it," he said, standing in Harold's kitchen. "You saved him. You love him. But he's not a dog. He's a tiger, and he crossed onto someone else's land. If it happens again, I'll have to call in state authorities." Harold didn't argue. But inside, he felt something burning. Anger, fear, and a rising sense of helplessness. The next morning, Harold reinforced the fence and built a second gate, but it didn't feel like enough. Kai had grown more curious, more independent. At night, he would pace instead of sleep. The bond with the dogs had changed. Focko no longer let Kai approach his food bowl. Sarge kept his distance. Only Odin tried to pretend things were still the same, but even he flinched when Kai growled during play. Desperate, Harold dug out an old photo album, the one with Talon, his son, when he was just a boy. There was one photo that stuck with him. Talon holding a baby fox they'd rescued, grinning from ear to ear. That was before the accident. Before the blame. Before the silence. Now, Harold felt that same pattern repeating, only this time with Kai. A creature he loved, but could no longer control. Just as Harold was about to close the album, his phone rang. A voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Cale Rourke from Channel 9. We'd like to do a story on your tiger. People are talking." Harold's stomach turned. Because once the world came looking, he knew nothing would be the same again. The news crew arrived 2 days later, uninvited. Cale Rourke, young, ambitious, and always searching for a headline that stirred emotions, stood at Harold's gate with a cameraman and a forced smile. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "we just want to look. You're a sensation online. People are calling this a miracle. A tiger raised by dogs." Harold refused at first. But Cale was persistent. "You don't have to say a word. Just let us film him playing in the yard." Against his better judgment, Harold agreed. Maybe, he thought, if the world saw Kai the way he did, they'd understand. But Kai wasn't in the mood for charm. As the camera began to roll, he paced along the fence, his tail flicking. Focko and the others stood still, watching with unease. When Cale leaned in too close, Kai let out a low, guttural sound. Not a roar, but something worse. A warning. The cameraman backed away quickly. Cale, trying to salvage the footage, smiled nervously and cut the scene short. "We'll edit it nice," he promised. "Don't worry." Within 48 hours, the story aired. Drone shots of the property. Voiceover narrating Harold's unusual choice. And then a clip of Kai snarling, eyes sharp, body tense. Experts warn. The report ended. That such situations can turn tragic without warning. The video went viral. What was once a quiet act of rescue had become a public debate. Animal lovers praised Harold's bond. Others called it reckless. The phones started ringing. Reporters, activists, officials. And then, his son. Tyrone Whitaker hadn't spoken to his father in over 10 years. The call was short, cold. "I saw the news," he said. "You're doing it again." Harold froze. "Doing what?" he asked. "Trying to replace what you lost with something wild," Tyrone replied, and hung up. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have been. Harold sat at the kitchen table, staring at the receiver, feeling old wounds tear back open. The tension grew at home too. That night, Kai growled at Falco when the older dog approached the porch. Sarge refused to eat. Odin whined near the barn, refusing to come inside. Harold stood in the doorway, unsure of whether he was watching his family fall apart, or a wild creature simply becoming what it was always meant to be. That same week, Slade Rennick returned, this time with a formal warning. "One more incident, and I'll have to escalate this." His words carried the weight of inevitability. Harold nodded, his eyes tired. As the sheriff drove off, Kai watched from the hilltop, unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon. And somewhere in the distance, something was coming, something Harold couldn't stop. The morning started like any other, quiet, gray, and still. But something in the air felt different, heavier. Harold sipped his coffee on the porch, eyes locked on the distant tree-line where Kai often disappeared during his morning walks. Falco sat beside him, stiff and alert. The bond between them had grown silent, like soldiers who no longer needed words. Sarge lay at Harold's feet, but Odin paced along the fence, ears twitching. They all felt it, a shift subtle but undeniable. That afternoon, Kai returned from the woods with blood on his fur. Not much, but enough. A rabbit, maybe a raccoon. But it wasn't just the blood, it was his posture. He didn't hide it. He didn't flinch when Harold approached. He stood tall, proud, eyes unwavering. It was no longer play. It was a hunt. The line between domestic and wild had finally blurred, and Harold couldn't look away. Later that day, as Harold tried to brush Kai down, Falco intervened. The old shepherd stepped between them, letting out a deep, deliberate growl. For the first time ever, Kai growled back. Louder, sharper. Sarge barked in confusion. Odin stood frozen, tail tucked. The air cracked with tension. Harold shouted, "Enough!" And both animals backed off. But it was clear. The unspoken truce that had held them together was starting to break. That night, Harold sat at the kitchen table staring at a photo of Tyrone, now bent and faded at the corners. He remembered the fights, the stubborn silences, the day Tyrone walked away without looking back. And now, without meaning to, Harold had raised another being who might do the same, but this one could tear everything apart before it left. The phone buzzed. A message from Tyrone. "You need to let him go, Dad, before he hurts someone. Or worse." The words dug deep. Harold knew Tyrone wasn't talking about Kai alone. He was talking about the weight Harold had carried since the accident that took Tyrone's younger brother. The grief, the guilt, the need to fix something that could never be undone. Maybe raising Kai had been more than a rescue. Maybe it had been a desperate attempt at redemption. Then, just before dawn, a scream pierced the air. It wasn't human, it was Falco. Harold ran outside barefoot, heart racing, and found the old shepherd limping, a gash on his shoulder. Kai stood 10 feet away, breath heavy, eyes glowing in the moonlight. Not in rage, not in remorse, in instinct. And for the first time since he arrived, Kai didn't return when Harold called his name. Harold sat beside Falco, gently wrapping a bandage around the old shepherd's shoulder. The dog didn't whimper. He only looked at Harold with tired eyes, as if to say, "I warned you." Outside, the first light of morning stretched across the fields, but Harold couldn't feel its warmth. Kai was gone, not just physically, He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And worse, he hadn't come back when called. That silence, that choice, haunted Harold more than the wound itself. He checked the barn, the shed, even the edge of the woods. No sign. Odin barked into the trees, as if calling for a brother who no longer recognized the sound. Sarge refused to leave Falco's side. Hours passed, and by late afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a reporter. It was Riker Voslin, a federal wildlife officer. Calm, cold, and unapologetic. "We've received multiple complaints," Riker said. "The footage, the attack. Your animal's a threat now, Mr. Whitaker. We're sending a team." Harold tried to explain, to defend Kai, but the man on the line had already made up his mind. "I've seen this before. It always ends the same way." The click of the call ending echoed louder than any roar. Harold sat motionless for minutes, the house around him suddenly too quiet. The fear in his chest wasn't just for Kai. It was for what the world would do to him now. He'd been seen, judged, and sentenced, all without being heard. As twilight crept in, headlights lit the road outside. But it wasn't the officers. It was Cormac Draylon, an old friend from Harold's army days. Cormac hadn't been back in years, but somehow, he knew. "Saw the story," he said, stepping out of the truck. "Figured you might need backup or forgiveness." They sat on the porch, the dogs at their feet. Cormac spoke slowly. "You tried to save something, Harold. Maybe because you couldn't save someone else." The name hung in the air, unspoken. Nathan, Talon's younger brother, the one who never made it past 13. Harold's voice cracked. "I just wanted to do it right this time. With Kai. I thought I could fix what broke." Cormac shook his head. "You don't fix grief. You carry it. But you can't carry it in the shape of a tiger." The words stung because they were true. But Harold still believed, deep down, that Kai hadn't chosen to be wild. Not yet. Then, as if summoned by thought, movement stirred in the woods. Two golden eyes gleamed from the shadows. Kai had returned. But he wasn't alone. Kai stepped from the woods in silence, his golden eyes fixed on Harold. Behind him, barely visible through the trees, stood another tiger. Slightly smaller, thinner, and trembling. It was a female, probably wild, probably lost. And somehow, Kai had found her. Harold's breath caught in his throat. It was no longer just about one tiger. It was about what Kai was becoming. A leader, a protector, a creature of the wild, but still watching Harold with something that resembled recognition. Harold didn't move. Falco barked once, low and defensive, while Odin stepped forward, ears pinned back. Sarge whimpered, unsure. The second tiger stayed at the edge of the clearing, cautious but curious. Kai looked between Harold and the others, not aggressive, but changed. He no longer waited for permission. He no longer belonged to this place. And still, part of him lingered, like a boy returning to the doorstep of a childhood home. Then came the roar of engines. 3 black trucks rolled up the gravel road, kicking dust into the air. Armed officers stepped out in coordinated motion. Riker Voslin led them, face unreadable, bulletproof vest strapped tight. "Everyone stay back," he ordered without even looking at Harold. "We track, tranquilize, relocate." The dogs barked in panic. The second tiger growled and retreated. Kai stood his ground. Harold raised his hands. "Don't shoot. He hasn't hurt anyone. He came back." Riker didn't flinch. "He's a wild animal harboring another. You had your chance." One of the officers lifted a tranquilizer rifle. That's when Falco lunged forward, barking furiously, placing himself between Kai and the threat. It was chaos, and the trigger hadn't even been pulled yet. In the confusion, the female tiger bolted. Kai turned instinctively, chasing after her into the woods. The officers followed, but Harold shouted, "Stop! He's not attacking. He's protecting her." Cormac grabbed Harold's arm, holding him back. "You'll only make it worse." But Harold's heart was already breaking. He tried to give Kai a home, but now the world had declared him an enemy. As night fell, the search continued through the woods. Flashlights cut through the darkness like warning signs. Falco paced restlessly, his old eyes watching the tree line. The silence that returned wasn't peace. It was the breath before a storm. And when the radios crackled with the words, "Target located," multiple heat signatures, Harold knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about losing Kai anymore. This was about saving what remained of himself. The woods were alive with beams of light, voices over radios, and the crackle of tension in every breath. Harold pushed through branches, ignoring Cormac's shouts behind him. He didn't care about orders, warnings, or jurisdiction. Kai was out there not as a threat but as a soul he had raised, a son in another form. And Harold would not let him be hunted like something disposable. Not again. He found them in the northern clearing, Kai and the female, cornered near a rock outcrop. 2 officers with tranquilizer rifles crouched nearby. One had already taken aim. "Wait!" Harold shouted, stepping into the light. Riker Voslin turned, furious. "Get him out of here!" But Harold kept walking. "I know him. Let me try." Falco was at his side, limping but determined. The old shepherd stopped ahead of Harold, growling low, protective as ever. His presence made everyone pause for just a second. Kai stood tall, ears twitching at the voices. His body blocked the smaller tiger, whose sides heaved with fear. But his eyes locked on Harold. Not wild, not angry, just waiting. One final test of trust. Harold raised both hands slowly. "It's okay," he whispered, barely audible. "Come home, Kai, please." For a moment, the forest held its breath. And then the snap of a branch. One of the officers, nervous or impatient, shifted position. The sound made the female tiger bolt again, and in an instant, Kai reacted. He lunged, not toward Harold, but toward the source of the sound. The officer panicked, pulled the trigger too high. The dart missed, but it was enough. Another shot rang out. Screams. Chaos. Falco leapt forward with a bark so fierce it silenced everything for a second. And then, nothing but the thud of paws running through leaves. Kai had disappeared again. Fleeing, vanishing into the forest. The shot had missed. For now. But Harold dropped to his knees, heart pounding, hands trembling. They had turned a moment of peace into a battle. Riker stood above him, breath heavy. "You saw it. He's not safe anymore." Harold didn't answer. He couldn't. Falco rested his head on Harold's lap, blood at his paw from a cut in the chaos. Sarge and Odin arrived moments later, sniffing the air, confused, tense. Cormac finally caught up, his eyes heavy with what he didn't need to say. As the team pulled back, night swallowed the clearing again. But the damage was done not just to the forest, not just to Kai, but to every fragile thread that still held this family together. The next morning came gray and silent. The search had been called off temporarily after the chaos in the woods. But Harold knew it was only a pause. The state would return, with more men, more weapons, and less patience. He sat on the porch, Falco resting beside him. A fresh bandage wrapped around the shepherd's front leg. Sarge and Odin lay close, unusually quiet. The sense of family that once defined them felt fractured, like something sacred had been dropped and cracked open. Then the sound of tires on gravel stirred the silence. A dusty blue pickup pulled into the driveway, and from it stepped Talon Whitaker. Older now, rough around the edges, with eyes that carried old anger and new hesitation. Harold stood slowly, unsure what to say. "You came," he muttered. Talon nodded once. "I saw what happened on the news. I figured, if I didn't come now, I'd never come." The words were stiff, but they were something. Inside, over coffee, the two sat in the kitchen that once echoed with laughter, then with silence. Talon stared at the framed photo on the wall. "Nathan, forever frozen at 13. You raised that tiger like you raised us," he said quietly. "But when he grew, you didn't know how to hold on." Harold didn't argue. "I didn't raise Kai to replace Nathan. I raised him because he needed someone. And maybe I needed it too." Talon leaned back, arms crossed. "He's not coming back, Dad. They'll find him. And next time, they won't miss. Harold looked out the window. Then I have to find him first. The silence between them stretched until Talon spoke again. Softer now. I used to think you gave more of yourself to animals than you ever gave to us. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe you were just giving what you had left. Before either of them could say more, the radio crackled in the sheriff's frequency. Large feline spotted near the Miller Ridge. Repeat. Tiger sighted moving east. Harold stood. Talon followed. No more time for words. This wasn't just about saving Kai now. It was about facing the grief neither of them had ever spoken aloud. Harold grabbed the tranquilizer rifle Vaughn had left behind. He didn't want to use it, but if it came to a choice between capturing Kai or seeing him killed, he'd make the only choice a father could. As they drove toward the ridge, the sun pierced through the clouds for the first time in days. A brief light in a dark storm, and ahead of them, deep in the trees, golden eyes were waiting. The forest was quiet when Harold and Talon reached the ridge. The earth beneath their boots was soft from the rain the night before, muffling their steps. The tranquilizer rifle weighed heavy in Harold's hands, not because of its metal, but because of what it meant. Beside him, Talon scanned the trees. He wasn't there to argue anymore. He was there to help his father do what needed to be done. Whether that meant goodbye or mercy. They spotted Kai just past the clearing. He stood in the tall grass, wind brushing against his fur like fingers saying farewell. The female tiger was gone, vanished into the wild where she belonged. But Kai had stayed, waiting, watching, as if part of him knew this moment would come. As if, deep down, he understood that the world had no place for what he had become. Not pet, not predator, something in between. Harold stepped forward slowly, whispering his name. Kai! The tiger turned his head, eyes meeting Harold's with something achingly human. Not fear, not anger, just recognition. Talon stayed back, heart pounding. Fauco and the other dogs had been left behind at the truck, but Harold could feel them there, in spirit, in memory. This was the final threshold, the last test between love and instinct. Harold raised the rifle but not to shoot. Instead, he lowered it to the ground. I won't be the one to end this, he said. Not after everything. Tears welled in his eyes. You can go, Kai, if that's what you choose. But if there's still a part of you that remembers this old man, come home. The words lingered in the wind, unanswered. Then, Kai stepped forward. Slow, careful. Each movement a bridge across impossible distance. Talon's breath caught. The tiger's head lowered slightly as he approached Harold. No growl, no tension. Just trust. Just history. When Kai reached him, Harold placed a hand gently on his head, fingers brushing across the stripes he knew by heart. No cage, no rope, no command. Only a moment of silent understanding. Riker's team never got the second chance to fire. By the time they returned, Harold had already made the call. He's gone, he told them. Into the wild. Just like he was meant to. No one questioned it. No one found Kai again. Weeks passed. Then months. The media moved on. But every now and then, near sunset, Harold swore he saw two golden eyes watching from the trees. Not hunting. Not hiding. Just remembering.